Hi, this is Bob Weller again for Stravinsky and Cubism, the third video here promoting my book Stravinsky and Cubism. And today I'd like to talk about Petrushka, which was Stravinsky's second great ballet for the Russian ballet in 1911, 1912. And the first scene is in the Moor's room, and it has to do with the Moor and the ballerina trying to have a romance. And I just want to make a note about the racist depiction of the Moor. The Moor is an African character, and the depiction of him is very crude and would not be acceptable in the 21st century. But apparently it was totally acceptable in European society in 1911. And it just interested me how the people back then, Europeans with attitudes of racial superiority and ethnic cultural superiority. In fact, the term primitivism, which is associated with Cubism, is a loaded word. It assumes a lot that's not true. But just thinking about the intelligentsia and all these very bright people walking around thinking that these attitudes were never going to hurt them and that they could go blissfully throughout their lives with these attitudes without anybody getting hurt. And that, of course, that turned out not to be the case in the 20th century. Having said that, we'll get to this first scene, which is the Moor and the ballerina trying to have a romance. And the romance is doomed because of their very different personalities. The bright, bubbly personality of the ballerina and the Moor's kind of dark, sinister personality, warlike personality. So the first thing you'll hear is the ballerina's music, which is going to sound like this. So that's her music when she starts her dance, and later she gets a little bit more lively, and that sounds like this. And underneath all that is the Moor's kind of sinister sounding music, which is basically kind of modal sounding in A flat minor, A flat Dorian probably. And this is in the English horn, so it's very easy to spot the melody. You won't miss it. They're trying to come to some kind of accommodation, some kind of romantic arrangement, which is doomed, of course, because they're wildly differing personalities. But the idea of the scene is to portray this as realistically as possible. That would be a Cubist aesthetic. And it would also be the aesthetic of analytical Cubism to have a collage of very dissimilar elements. For example, this little waltz, the sinister Moor's music, and later on, totally inappropriate percussion accompaniment, which you will hear, especially towards the end. They start doing a two-beat with cymbals, which just has nothing to do with this waltz. And so we'll see that now. This is a collage of dissimilar elements, and this is the Moor's room. So in this next scene, we're back at the Shrovetide Fair, which is in full swing. There's dancing and revelry. And in the middle of this, the whole thing is interrupted very suddenly by a dancing bear and his trainer, which incidentally I think is, I'm pretty sure it's a live bear. It certainly looks like a live bear. And he does a bunch of tricks with the bear. You'll hear the music. It's very sudden. It comes in like this. Etc. And then after that goes on for a minute, you'll hear the fair music come in the background, coming back in the harmonica motif. It goes up to this, I believe. And this, as the bear walks away with the trainer, this harmonica motive comes out of the background and moves into the foreground. That's an example of passage, which we talked about before in connection with Cézanne. And the next section is they're looking into a peep show, and it's a development of this D minor 11 chord. And it stays static on that chord, but it's developed instrumentally. You'll hear the instrumentation move around on that one chord, and that's just a good example of passage and how this background material, the fair, receded and then came into the foreground very gradually, and you'll hear that as the bear is walking away. The next scene starts again with the Shrovetide Fair, the dancing and revelry, and in the middle of that is this very surrealistic moment where you'll hear a trumpet, a single trumpet note, which signals the distress of the three main characters. But meanwhile, the people in the crowd keep dancing as if they haven't heard it. It's a beautiful moment. It's really leading up to the climax of the whole piece. What happens immediately after that is the Moor is chasing Petrushka around the stage behind the curtain, and there's a lot of fragmentation, the most fragmentation we've seen so far in Petrushka. We hear Petrushka's motives, that, and also a bunch of black over white key stuff like that kind of thing, the Moor's music, but it's all very fragmented as they move around behind this curtain, and ultimately the Moor strikes Petrushka down with a saber, and Petrushka has a long death scene. And this death scene is interesting on several levels. For one thing, it's revealed that Petrushka is half human and half puppet because half of his mask falls off You'll see that. And during this section, Stravinsky goes back to his old Russian style of composition, a la Rimsky-Korsakov and the Russian Five, for a short section, maybe 30 seconds, where Petrushka is expiring. And so we're, in a sense, we're saying goodbye to Petrushka. We're also saying goodbye to that Russian style, because as far as I know, that was it. He never wrote in that style again. And Petrushka passes away, and that's the end of that scene. Shortly after Petrushka dies, the magician comes back, and his music sounds like this. He shakes Petrushka's corpse to show the crowd that he was just a puppet after all. And then it's increasing fragmentation all the way to the end of the piece, totally unlike any other ballet that had ever been done, as far as I know. It just disintegrates, basically, instead of coming to some kind of triumphant conclusion like the Firebird. So we get the harmonica motif, or the accordion motif. So eventually it settles on that. This sounds like an accordion or a harmonica. And that sets the stage for the return of Petrushka's ghost, where he hangs out over the top of the theater, and revealing that he had a soul after all, that he actually was human. And so he mocks the magician. That music sounds like this. Etc. So he's hanging over the top of the building, mocking the magician. Then he has a last gasp where he, let me see what it was. Like that, a little more harmonica music. So totally inconclusive kind of ending, which is something new and very 20th century. So here's the last scene of Petrushka. So that was Petrushka, which was kind of the training ground for the next piece, which was the Rite of Spring. In Petrushka, we saw a lot of Cubist metaphors. Simultaneity, we talked about already. That's the Petrushka's chord, the F sharp major and C major triads. Also collage, numerous examples of collage, especially in the fairground scenes. Passage as the background of the accordion music comes in and out and comes into the foreground or recedes one way or the other. And also at the end, a lot of fragmentation, extreme fragmentation, more than I had ever seen in any music up to that point. So that's Petrushka, and for the next video we'll be talking about the Rite of Spring, which is probably the most Cubist piece that Stravinsky wrote, and his breakthrough and the piece that he became world famous for. So that's for next time. Thank you.